Melancholia is the brutal disaffection that characterizes our saturated systems. Once the hope of balancing good and evil, true and false, indeed of confronting some values of the same order, once the more general hope of relation of forces and stake has vanished, everywhere, always, the system is too strong, hegemonic. Against this hegemony of the system, one can exalt the ruses of desire, practice revolutionary micrology of the quotidian, exalt the molecular drift, or even defend cooking. This does not resolve the imperious necessity of checking the system in broad daylight. This only terrorism can do. It is the trait of reversion that effaces the remainder, just as a single ironic smile effaces a whole discourse, just as a single flash of denial in a slave effaces all the power and pleasure of the master. The more hegemonic the system, the more the imagination is struck by the smallest of its reversals. The challenge, even infinitesimal, is the image of a chain failure. Only this reversibility without a counterpart is an event today, on the nihilistic and disaffected stage of the political. Only it mobilizes the imaginary. If being a nihilist is carrying to the unbearable limit of hegemonic systems this radical trait of derision and of violence, this challenge that the system is summoned to answer through its own death, then I am a terrorist and nihilist in theory as the others are with their weapons. Theoretical violence, not truth, is the only resource left us. But such a sentiment is utopian, because it would be beautiful to be a nihilist if there were still a radicality, as it would be nice to be a terrorist if death, including that of a terrorist, still had meaning. But it is at this point that things become insoluble, because to this active nihilism of radicality, the system opposes its own, the nihilism of neutralization. The system is itself also nihilistic, in the sense that it has the power to pour everything, including what denies it, into indifference. In this system, death itself shines by virtue of its absence. Death no longer has a stage, neither phantasmatic nor political, on which to represent itself, to play itself out, either a ceremonial or a violent one. And this is the victory of the other nihilism, of the other terrorism, that of the system. There is no longer a stage, nor even the minimal illusion that makes events capable of adopting the force of reality. We are in the era of events without consequences, and of theories without consequences. There is no more hope for meaning, and without a doubt this is a good thing. Meaning is mortal, but that on which it has imposed its ephemeral reign, what it hoped to liquidate in order to impose the reign of the Enlightenment, that is, appearances, they are immortal, invulnerable to the nihilism of meaning or of non-meaning itself. I think you've suggested that the advent of language, aside from the enormous value of it, was disruptive. Very disruptive. Of a piece with its value. Creative destruction. All sorts of talents and skills must have been lost, mostly communicative. But also things like navigation, and probably even the richness of dreams. In the end, this strange new code must have replaced at least part of the world with what can be said about it. Reality with opinion, narrative with commentary, and sanity with madness. Don't forget. Yes, I won't. The word Jinn means illusion, or apparition. In India, a man who uses conjury is called a genjutsushi, or a master of illusion technique. Everything in this world is but a marionette show. Thus, we use the word Jinn. In the Cartesian project, there is at least the inauguration of a rational principle. It is from this rational principle that the whole question of doubt arises. This doubt comes from the subject as subject of knowledge, as subject of discourse. Whether Descartes in fact succeeds in making the subject constitute itself in its reality in relation to a diabolical world which is full of superstitions and hallucinations and so on is a controversial matter. But the fact remains that Cartesian doubt is based on the promise of a world which can be confirmed only in terms of its own reality. There is doubt on the one hand, and there is reality on the other hand. And there is the conflict between the two, which Descartes tries to resolve. For me, the question is totally different. When I evoke the principle of evil, of an evil demon, etc., my aim is more closely related to a certain kind of Manichaeism. It is therefore anterior to Descartes, and fundamentally it is irrational. There are in fact two principles at stake. On the one hand, there is the rational principle, or principle of rationality, the fundamental attempt, through doubt or anything else, to rationalize the world. And on the other hand, there is the inverse principle, which was, for example, adopted by the heretics all the way through the history of Christianity. This is the principle of evil itself. What the heretics posited was that the very creation of the world, hence the reality of the world, was the result of the existence of the evil demon. The function of God, then, was really to try to repudiate this evil phantom. That was the real reason why God had to exist at all. So, in this situation, it is no longer a question of doubt or non-doubt, of whether one should exercise this doubt or whether this doubt could lead us to confirm or deny the existence of the world. Rather, it is once again the principle of seduction that needs to be invoked in this situation. According to Manichaeism, the reality of the world is a total illusion. It is something which has been tainted from the very beginning. It is something which has been seduced by a sort of irreal principle since time immemorial. In this case, what one has to invoke is precisely this absolute power of illusion. And this is indeed exactly what the heretics did. They based their theologies on the very negation of the real. Their principal and primary convention was that of the non-reality, hence of the non-rationality of the world. They believed that the world, its reality, is made up only of signs, and that it was governed solely through the power of the mind. This idea of the world as being constituted only by signs is, if you like, some sort of magic thinking, and indeed it was condemned as such, for it does entail that the real, and any sort of reality that one sees in the world is quite simply an absolute utopia. The rationality that one has to invoke in order to make the world real is really just a product of the power of thought itself, which is itself totally anti-rational and anti-materialist. This is completely opposed to Descartes, whose rationalism leads eventually, but directly, to materialism. For me to invoke the question of doubt, or of non-doubt, and to either assert or to question the reality of the world would be completely futile. The principle fundamentally and from the beginning is that there is no objectivity to the world. Nevertheless, one has to recognize the reality of the illusion, and one must play upon this illusion itself and the power that it exerts. This is where the Manichaean element in my work comes in. It is a question which really is purely strategic. The slavery which is felt by man as violence from without is to be hated less passionately than the slavery which seduces man and which he has come to love. The new mode of social control avoids conflicts and direct confrontations between authorities and the people on whom they seek to impose their will. Because confrontations provoke arguments about principle, The authorities, whenever possible, delegate discipline to someone else, so that they themselves can pose as friendly helpers. The diffusion of discipline, even within the family, provides the new forms of control with a solid basis in the individual's early experience. Having been taught from infancy to measure his demands not against abstract moral standards but against reality, the child submits all the more willingly to the reality principle as an adult. His own view of the world corresponds to the view of those who seek to control him. Today, the state controls not merely the individual's body, but as much of his spirit as it can preempt. Not merely his outer, but his inner life as well. Not merely the public realm, but the darkest corners of private life, formerly inaccessible to political domination. The decline of the family brings with it the decline of romantic love, the decline of transcendent ideals in general, and the undisputed triumph of the reality principle. That reality has triumphed over pleasure in the name of pleasure itself, a debased and commercialized leisure organized by the same forces that have debased work, completes the irony that the individual's subjection to new forms of coercion rests on his, quote, emancipation.